The sun over New Mexico burned hotter than judgment as Calder Wyatt guided his Dunmore across the open land. He'd been following the faint tracks of a missing steer since morning, the trail fading where the ground split and baked. Out here, the world felt stripped bare-wined, sighing through dry brush, leather settling against the saddle, and the occasional cry of a hawk drifting over the canyon walls. Calder preferred that kind of quiet. It felt honest. He was just about to turn back when he heard something so faint he thought at first it was a trick of the wind, a thin, broken sound, a breath that didn't seem committed to staying alive. Calder stopped cold, his muscles tightening before he even understood why. There it was again. He swung down from the saddle, tied the reins to a dead juniper branch, and grabbed his rifle. Each step through the brush felt heavier than the last, guided by instinct more than sight. When he finally pushed through a ring of old cottonwoods, he saw her. A girl, no older than 18, hung from a low branch by her wrists. Her weight slumped forward as though the world had already given up on her. Her toes scraped the earth, but didn't reach enough to help her stand. Her skin was dark with sun and dirt, her long black hair clotted with sweat and dried blood. She looked like someone half finished by life, left suspended between surviving and slipping away. Calder's gaze snapped upward to the sign nailed above her head. A crude piece of wood, the letters smeared in thick, angry strokes of red. White. Man, don't forgive ye. A chill crawled down Calder's spine despite the heat. It felt less like a warning and more like a curse someone wanted carved into bone. He scanned the tree line. Nothing but stillness. No riders waiting to ambush. No voices, only the dry rattle of wind through dead leaves. What the hell? He breathed, stepping closer. The girl stirred at the sound, a small groan leaving her lips. The rope had cut deep into her wrists. Skin rubbed raw and blistered. Whoever tied her up hadn't planned on mercy. "You hear me, girl?" Calder asked quietly. His voice was rough, unused to gentleness. She didn't answer. Her head only sagged a little more. He hesitated. That sign above her screamed things he'd never done, but somehow felt blamed for anyway. He could have walked away, should have, maybe. But the sound she made, thin and desperate, snapped something inside him. "I ain't them," he muttered, almost an oath to the empty desert. His knife slid clean through the rope. Her body crumpled forward, and he barely caught her before she hit the ground. She was fever-hot, trembling like she'd been burning from the inside out. Her eyelids fluttered open, dark eyes unfocused and full of fear. Calder knelt with her in the dirt, easing her down gently, his breath unsteady. "Easy now?" he whispered, lifting his canteen. He dampened a cloth and touched it to her lips. "You're safe, at least for the moment." She tried to speak, but no words came, only a weak grip on his sleeve, as if anchoring herself to the only thing not trying to kill her. Calder shrugged off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. She was too light, too warm. A person shouldn't feel like that unless the world had already tried to erase them. "You got a name?" he asked. Silence. Her eyes dipped closed again, breath shallow. "All right," he murmured. "We'll figure one out later." He picked her up, careful as if she were made of something fragile and irreplaceable, and carried her back toward the horse. The sun dipped lower as he rode toward home, the girl limp against his chest, her breaths barely brushing his shirt. By the time he reached his ranch, lonely stretch of land with a leaning barn and a windmill that groaned in the breeze, the sky had begun to turn copper. Calder lifted her from the saddle and carried her inside his one-room house. The place was rough but clean, the kind of place built by a man who expected little but worked for everything. He laid her on his cot, the lantern casting a soft glow over her bruised skin. Fetching a basin of water, he knelt beside her and washed the dirt from her legs and feet. She twitched once, but didn't pull away. "I ain't gonna harm you," he told her softly, though he doubted she could understand. Much in her state. Just trying to set things right. The water in the basin turned murky as he cleaned away the blood and dust. Her wounds told a story without words of someone punished, not for what she'd done, but for what she was. He wrapped her feet, covered her with a blanket, and stepped back, unsure why his chest felt tight. "You'll rest here," he said quietly. "I'll take the barn." She didn't answer, but her breathing steadied, just enough to sound like the next days settled into a rhythm, slow and cautious, like the desert itself was learning how to breathe again. Inside Calder's cabin, the silence remained, but it had changed shape. It wasn't the lonely kind he'd grown used to it, felt. Watchful now, weighted with the presence of the girl he'd rescued. He still called her Lena in his mind, the name appearing the moment he saw her lying half-conscious on his cot. She ate when he brought food, though she barely took more than a few bites. Her movements were small, controlled, like she feared any sudden gesture might summon danger back into the room. And always, her eyes tracked him when she thought he wasn't paying attention. At night, Calder took his bedroll to the barn. He told himself it was for her comfort, but deep down he knew it was more complicated. Her being here reopened parts of his life he'd sealed off long ago, parts filled with grief, with questions he didn't want to face. And that sign, those hateful words painted in red, they lingered in his mind like a flame that refused to die. On the third morning, something shifted. He'd stepped outside to check the fencing when his boot caught a shape in the dirt fresh. A single footprint, smaller than his own, angled toward the barn. He crouched, tracing its edges with a rough thumb, not Lena's, and not old. Whoever left it had been there within hours. His shoulders tensed. He scanned the ridge, the rocks, the empty stretch of land beyond the windmill. Nothing, but the stillness felt wrong, as if someone had held their breath just before disappearing. When he stepped back into the cabin, Lena was sitting by the window, wrapped in a blanket. She didn't look up when he entered, but her spine straightened like a bow being drawn. "You see anyone around?" Calder asked. No response. She only tightened the blanket around herself, her jaw clenched. "I think we've got company," he murmured, mostly to himself. That night, Calder sat outside on the porch with his rifle laid across his lap. He kept the lantern low, letting the darkness do half the watching. The desert had gone quiet, no wind, no coyotes, just the kind of hush that felt like a warning. Through the cabin walls, he heard Lena moving softly, pacing. She didn't sleep, and neither did he. The next day arrived heavy with heat. Around midday, a single rider emerged from the shimmering horizon, dust curling around the legs of a chestnut horse. The man wore the blue and gold of the cavalry, his uniform dusty but unmistakable. Calder stepped forward as the soldier pulled his horse to a stop. "Wyatt?" The man called, voice sharp. "Depends," Calder said calmly. "Who's asking?" "Lieutenant Graham, Dust Hollow Station." The man pulled a paper from his breast pocket, offering it down to Calder. "We're hunting a fugitive. You seen this girl?" Calder took the paper, knowing full well what he'd find. A rough sketch of a young Apache woman, sharp features, long hair. Underneath the drawing, "Wanted for murder. Dangerous. Reward, $50." Calder's jaw locked, but his expression didn't betray a thing. "Can't say I've run across her," he said, handing back the notice. The lieutenant frowned. "She's quiet. Hurt maybe, might be hiding. Reports say someone cut her loose over by Cottonwood Flats." He leaned closer. "If she's out here, she's not alone." Calder shrugged lightly. "Ain't seen much besides jackrabbits and my own shadow." The lieutenant's eyes narrowed. This girl is part of a violent group. Savages. If you find anything or anyone, send word. She's trouble." Calder met his stare without flinching. "I'll remember." Lieutenant Graham gave a curt nod and rode off, dust swirling in. His wake. When Calder stepped back inside, Lena was standing just behind the curtain, her eyes sharp and unreadable. She had heard everything. "They came looking," he said, setting his hat aside. "Said you were wanted. Said you were dangerous." Her expression didn't crack, but her breathing changed, a slow, guarded inhale. "I told them no," he added. Quietly, she stared at him, confused and wary. "I don't know what happened to you," he said, turning away under the weight of her gaze. "Maybe someday you'll tell me. But out here, a man decides who he is, and I've made my choice." He moved toward the stove, pretending to check the pot of beans, though they'd finished cooking an hour ago. Behind him, something shifted. Just a breath, just a tiny step, but it felt like the whole room changed. Trust didn't bloom between them then, not fully. But it cracked open a thin line of light in a very dark place. That was enough for now. The afternoon light stretched long across the yard, the sun dipping low as if it too was wary of lingering. Calder sat on the porch sharpening his knife, each scrape of the blade against the stone echoing in the quiet. The rhythm steadied his nerves, kept his mind from wandering where he didn't want it to go, toward the girl inside, toward the men who might return, toward that sign still burning in the back of his memory. He paused mid-stroke. Soft footsteps crunched over the gravel light. Careful. Human. Calder lifted his head. Lena was outside. It was the first time she'd stepped past the cabin door since. He brought her home. Her bare feet moved as if testing the ground for danger, finding something she lost or feared she might lose again. The blanket he'd given her hung around her shoulders like a cocoon, slipping low over her elbows as she walked out. Calder didn't move at first. He didn't want to scare her back inside. He watched quietly, a kind of awe settling in his chest. Out here, she looked small against the vastness of the land, but not helpless. There was something new in her posture, still fragile, yes, but filled with a quiet determination. She wasn't running. She was reclaiming. She crossed the yard toward the barn until she reached a patch of cleared dirt, swept clean by the wind. Slowly, she knelt. The blanket slid down further, pooling behind her. She reached for a small stick near her knee and began to draw in the dirt with slow, deliberate strokes. Only then did Calder rise. That night, the wind edged through the rafters of the small cabin, whispering along the walls like something searching for a way in. Calder sat near the fire pit, boots off, sleeves rolled, stirring a pot of beans more out of habit than hunger. He could feel the weight of everything that had passed between him and the girl outside. The story she'd carved into the dirt, the grief that shook her, the truth she had finally spoken aloud. It all hung in the air like smoke. Lena stood by the narrow window, arms folded around herself. The desert night wrapped the world in shades of blue and silver. For the first time since he brought her here, the silence between them didn't feel sharp. It was softer, shared. She turned suddenly, eyes settling on him with a clarity he hadn't seen before. "You want to know the truth?" Her voice was quiet, but it carried. Calder looked up, spoon pausing mid-stir. He nodded once, slow, inviting. Lena moved to the table and sat opposite him. For a long moment she didn't speak. She only breathed, steadying herself. Then the words began to come, not rushed, not forced, but deliberate. "My father was a minor chief," she said. "Our band, small, peaceful, we traded with settlers, learned their prayers. We kept to our land, never asked for more." Calder rested his elbows on the table, giving her the space to speak her pain into the world. "Last winter," she continued, A white woman died near our hunting grounds. Throat cut. Her fingers curled around the edge of the table. Her husband said we killed her, but we didn't. Everyone knew he was a cruel man, but the town believed him. They wanted someone to blame. She lifted her eyes to Calder's. He saw the battle in them, fear and strength side by side. The soldiers came, not just them. Ranchers, townspeople, all with rifles. They said they wanted justice. Her voice thinned. But they wanted revenge. She swallowed hard. They burned our camp, shot my brothers while they slept. My mother died with the prayer beads the priest gave her. My father, her breath shuddered. They hanged him from the council pole. Calder's jaw tightened. His stomach felt heavy, hot with anger he hadn't known he was carrying. They found me hiding in a tree hollow, she went on. They took my knife, beat me, sighed I meant to seek vengeance. Sighed I was dangerous. They tied me, questioned the beat. Her voice wavered, but she pushed through. Then they hung me from that cottonwood. Said anyone still alive would come running to help me, and they would shoot them too. Silence fell, thick as storm clouds. Calder's breath felt lodged in his chest. For who? He finally asked. Who were you bait for? For my people? She whispered. For the last of us. She looked at him, eyes raw. Why did you cut me down? Calder didn't answer at first. His gaze drifted to the fire, where embers glowed like tiny hearts still burning. When he spoke, his voice was almost a confession, because once he paused, swallowing past something jagged in his throat. Once I failed someone I loved. Lena frowned slightly, urging him to go on. My family, he said. Last spring raiders hit our ranch. Folks said Apache. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. His voice flattened, scraped thin by memory. I was out hunting. Came back to ashes. He stared at the flames. My sister? She was 16. I heard her crying in the barn. But I was scared. I waited for help, instead of going in. His jaw clenched. She died before anyone came. The confession rolled into the room like thunder, settling deep. Lena absorbed it, her chest rising with a slow, shaky breath. You saved me, she whispered. Because you couldn't save her. He nodded once, without looking up. She studied him, really studied him, for the first time. The man who'd cut her down. The man who'd chosen to lie to soldiers for her. The man haunted by a different kind of fire. Tell me something, she said softly. If I had been white, would you still have pulled the knife? Calder stood, pushing his chair back gently. He walked around the table until he stood in front of her. She tilted her face up to him, searching for truth, not kindness, not comfort-truth. He lifted his hand, cupping her chin the way a man touches something fragile, but not breakable. I don't love skin, he said. I love what breathes under it. Her breath hitched. Her eyes welled, but she didn't cry this time. Instead, she lifted her hand and placed it over his, holding him there. A silent answer. Then, as if the air between them had been pulling them closer all along, they leaned in. The kiss was soft, hesitant at first, two wounded souls, testing the strength of something unfamiliar. But then it deepened, slow and full, as though the world outside their cabin had vanished and left them suspended in a moment that felt impossibly fragile and impossibly right. When they finally pulled apart, morning came with a restless wind, the kind that swept across the plains like it carried warnings instead of dust. Calder felt it in his bones before he even stepped outside, the sense that something had shifted, something coming their way. Storms didn't always announce themselves with thunder. Sometimes they arrived on horseback. 3 days had passed since the night he and Lena finally let their guarded hearts touch. 3 days of quiet moments woven between chores and small, tentative smiles. Lena moved differently now. She fed the animals, swept the porch, even teased Calder once when he dropped a bucket of feed. A small laugh, just one, but it had felt like sunlight squeezing through storm clouds. Yet beneath their fragile peace, a thin thread of tension. HUMMED. By noon. That day, the storm broke. Calder stood near the fence line when he spotted dust trailing up from the east. Not the drifting kind that came from wind. This had purpose, direction. Riders. He felt his chest tighten as he picked up his rifle. 3 men approached, all wearing worn canvas coats and battered hats. Their faces carried the kind of confidence men earn from violence, not justice. At their center rode Joe Prescott, a man who liked calling himself a sheriff, though no one had ever voted for him. A tin badge hung crookily on his chest, gleaming in the sun like something stolen. "Wyatt!" Prescott called, swinging off his horse with a thud. "Heard tell you might be harboring someone who don't belong." Calder's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed even. "You hear all kinds of things, Joe. Doesn't mean any of them are true." Prescott spat into the dirt, a wet thump that made the air feel smaller. "A girl. Apache. There's a reward, $50 cash, and the Z. Satisfaction of every God-fearing man west of the Pecos." Calder didn't flinch. "You rode all this way for a rumor?" Prescott stepped closer, close enough for Calder to smell whiskey on his breath. "We aim to look inside your house, just in case." Calder moved off the porch, slow and steady. "You got a warrant?" Prescott barked out a laugh. "You think this is a court, Wyatt?" Behind him, the other 2 men shifted in their saddles, hands drifting toward their rifles. The air tightened, dry and sharp. Calder felt every beat of his heart, measured and quiet. "I live alone," he said. "Ain't no girl here. Just me, the ghosts, and a mule too stubborn to die." Prescott searched his face for a crack in the mask, but Calder gave him nothing. After a long simmering stare, the self-appointed sheriff finally grunted. "If you're lying, you'll burn with her." They rode off in a spray of dust, leaving the yard quiet again. Too quiet. Calder didn't breathe easy, not for a second. That night, he built a fire behind the barn. The sky was a heavy black, clouds smothering the stars. He sat on an overturned crate, turning something over in his hands, something he'd dug up from where he'd buried it. The sign, the same crude plank of wood that had hung above Lena's head. The letters were faded but still legible. "White man don't far jive." He hated the look of it. Hated how the words clung to him like burrs. In wool. He held it for a moment longer, then carried it to the fire. He didn't say anything. No curses, no prayers. Just laid the sign on the kindling and struck a match. The flames licked up slowly, then devoured the hateful message with a crackle that sounded almost like protest. The wood curled inward, shrinking, fighting its end. Behind him came footsteps, light ones. Lena. She wore one of his old coats, sleeves rolled twice, the hem brushing her knees. She stepped beside him, eyes fixed on the flames. She didn't speak, but she moved close enough that her shoulder touched his. "I should have burned it sooner," Calder said quietly. Lena didn't answer right away. She only tightened the coat. Around her, her fingers twisting the fabric. Finally, she whispered, "Thank you." 2 simple words. But in them lived everything she couldn't yet say. Everything he didn't know how to say back. The fire ate the last of the sign until only embers remained. For the first time since he cut her down, there was no symbol left of the cruelty done to her. No wood, no words, no evidence. Only the choice they stood beside together. Only heat, smoke, and a future they hadn't dared name. When the flames settled, Calder looked at her, really looked at her, and something inside him Something long buried felt like it was finally waking. Wind softened to a hush. The night settled around them like a blanket. They stood shoulder to shoulder, watching the fire die, both knowing deep down the world wouldn't let them keep this peace for long, but for now, for this small moment carved out of a hostile land. They were safe. They were together. The next morning rose strangely still. No wind. The night settled thick around the canyon, the narrow paths swallowing every sound except the soft rush of the river somewhere beyond the rocks. A thin moon broke through a gap in the clouds, washing the cliff faces in pale silver. In the shelter of a small hidden hollow, Calder lay propped on folded blankets, breath slow but steady. The fever that had threatened to drag him under had passed. He was still weak, but alive. Lena sat beside him with a basin of cool water, wringing out a cloth and gently wiping his forehead. Her touch was careful, practiced, as if every movement carried the intention to hold him on this side of the world. Calder watched her through half-lidded eyes, a tired smile tugging at his lips. "You always this bossy with your patients?" He murmured. She lifted an eyebrow, but didn't stop tending to him. "Only the ones too stubborn to die." A short laugh escaped him before he winced, pain tightening his jaw. She pressed a hand against his chest, not forceful, just enough to quiet him. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It felt full, threaded with something gentle and new. The wind sighed outside as he spoke again, voice low. "Tell me something true." She looked at him, waiting. "What's your real name?" Her breath caught. For a moment she seemed unsure whether to answer. Then she reached for his hand and guided it to her chest, letting him feel the slow, steady beat beneath her ribs. "Ayanna," she whispered. "My father gave me the name. It means peaceful river." Calder closed his eyes, letting the words settle into him like water, finding a place to rest. "Ayanna?" he repeated softly. "You're the only peace I've known in a long time." This time she didn't cry. She simply held his hand tighter, grounding them both. The days that followed were slow but steady. They stayed hidden in the canyon, tending Calder's wound and conserving supplies. Ayanna hunted small game with traps and collected herbs she recognized from childhood teachings. Calder grew stronger, his color returning, the fever sliding off him like a shedding skin. When he could walk again, even if only a few steps at a time, they began pushing south deeper toward the land promised by rumor and hope. By the time they crossed into the foothills of the Sierra Madre, months had passed. They found a small bend in a river sheltered by tall sycamores and brush. The air there felt clean, untouched. A place the world had forgotten. It became home. A small lodge rose beside the river, constructed from pine and hide, shaped by Calder's hands and Ayanna's memory of how her people once built shelters. The structure wasn't large, but it was warm, sturdy, and alive with the scent of sap and earth. Outside, reeds whispered with every breeze, and wildflowers dotted the riverbank. Under the shade of the awning, Ayanna sat cross-legged, humming softly while stitching a tiny white shirt. Her belly had grown round beneath a woven sasha, quiet miracle that shifted the way she walked and the way Calder hovered near her with cautious adoration. Her hands moved gracefully, threading the needle through cotton with practiced ease. She smiled as she worked, a smile that lived in her eyes as much as her lips. A little distance away, Calder trained a young mustang, speaking to it in calm, low tones. Occasionally he turned, just to catch sight of her silhouette in the doorway. Every time he did, a warm, familiar ache touched his chest, something like gratitude, something like awe. Inside the lodge, herbs hung drying from the rafters. A child's blanket, unfinished but nearly complete, lay neatly folded on a shelf. The space carried no trophies, no reminders of violence, It held only what they chose to bring into this new life. Books Calder had carried for years, Ayana's mother's prayer beads, and the hope stitched into every seam she sewed. One evening, Ayana walked down to the riverbank, bare feet sinking into the cool sand. The current moved gently over the rocks, whispering a song older than memory. She stepped into the shallows, letting the water wash over her toes. Both hands came to rest on her belly. "Little one," she murmured, "your father? He didn't. Just forgive. He loved. And he kept his promise to me, to you." Footsteps approached softly through the grass. Calder joined her, slipping his hand into hers without a word. They stood together, watching the river drift under the dusk, while the first stars blinked awake overhead. No one in the world would have expected a hunted girl and a lonely rancher to build a life like this, to carve peace out of a land that had tried to take everything from them. But here they were, two survivors, two souls who had chosen each other in a place where choosing anything at all was a risk. Love didn't erase the scars, but it grew around them, gentle and stubborn. The river kept flowing steady, peaceful, like her name, like their life, like something finally, impossibly home. The seasons shifted softly along the southern borderlands, each one leaving its quiet mark on the little lodge by the river. Spring arrived with warm winds that carried the scent of wild sage, and Ayana's footsteps grew slower, her smile deeper. Calder walked with her every morning along the riverbank, steadying her when the ground felt uneven, his palm warm against hers. Their life had taken on a rhythm gentle, certain, a stark contrast to the chaos that had once chased them across the desert. Calder rose early to tend the horses, splitting wood when the air turned cool, mending saddles or hammering new beams into place when needed. Ayana cooked over the small hearth, her hands skilled at turning simple ingredients into comforting meals. Some evenings they would sit outside, sharing stories, weaving memories into the peaceful space they had built. The lodge was humble, but every corner of it felt alive with purpose.